Summer nights. There's a certain magic to them, isn't there? The air is warm, thick with the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. The sound of crickets is a constant, comforting rhythm. It's a season of freedom, of late nights spent with friends, of windows left open to catch a cool breeze. We associate summer with light, with life, with good memories. But the dark in summer is different. It's heavier. The familiar chirping of insects can suddenly sound like a warning. The rustling leaves in the trees can sound like footsteps. And when the sun goes down, the world we know transforms. The shadows get longer, deeper, and sometimes they hide things. Things that don't belong in our idyllic memories of summer. Tonight, we're not talking about the bright, sunny days. We're stepping into that heavy, warm darkness. I have 3 stories for you. These aren't legends or myths. They are experiences submitted by people who looked into the summer night and saw something looking back. Our first story comes from a woman named Clara. This happened back in the summer of 2008. Clara was 17, and her family had rented a small, isolated cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota for their annual 2-week vacation. It was the classic summer getaway. The cabin was rustic, smelled of pine and damp wood, and had a long, rickety dock stretching out into the dark, still water. For the first week, everything was perfect. Days were spent swimming, fishing, and reading in a hammock. Nights were for board games and listening to her dad's old radio. Clara loved the quiet. She was the kind of teenager who enjoyed her own company. Each night, before bed, she had a little ritual. She would sneak out of the cabin, walk to the end of the dock, and just sit there, watching the moon reflect on the water. It was her moment of peace. The second week is when things started to feel off. It began subtly. One night, as she sat on the dock, she heard a splash in the water, far to her left, near a thick patch of reeds along the shoreline. She figured it was a big fish or maybe a beaver. She didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, another splash, this time a little closer. Still, nothing to be alarmed about. The woods were alive at night. The next night, she went out to the dock again. The air was incredibly still. No breeze, and the water was like a sheet of black glass. She sat down, and almost immediately, she heard the splash again. Same spot. But this time, it was followed by a soft, dragging sound, like something wet being pulled through mud and weeds. She strained her eyes, peering into the darkness along the shore, but she couldn't see anything past the first few feet of reeds. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The peaceful silence she'd enjoyed just nights before now felt watchful. She quickly got up and went back inside, locking the door behind her, a habit she hadn't bothered with before. She tried to brush it off. Overactive imagination. That's what her dad would say. 2 nights later was the last night of their vacation. Clara was determined to have her final moment on the dock. She told herself she was being silly. She crept out of the cabin. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, milky light over everything. As she stepped onto the dock, the old wood groaned under her feet. She walked to the end, her heart pounding a little faster than usual. She sat down, hugged her knees to her chest, and took a deep breath. For a few minutes, there was only silence. The beautiful, peaceful silence she had missed. She smiled to herself, feeling relieved. And then she heard it. It wasn't a splash this time. It was a voice. A low, gurgling whisper that seemed to come from right underneath the dock. It was too garbled to be words, more like the sound of someone trying to speak with a mouthful of water. Clara froze, every muscle in her body tensing. It was so close. Her mind raced. Was it a prank? Some local kids trying to scare the tourists? But who would be out here, in the water, in the middle of the night? She slowly, ever so slowly, leaned over the edge of the dock and looked down into the black water. The moonlight didn't penetrate the surface. She saw nothing but her own faint, terrified reflection. Then the whispering stopped. She held her breath, listening. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise. After what felt like an eternity, she started to get up, ready to sprint back to the cabin. But as she rose, a movement on the far shore caught her eye. Directly across the lake, on the opposite bank, there was another dock belonging to a cabin that was clearly empty and had been for years. And standing at the end of that dock was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, silhouetted against the moonlit trees. It was perfectly still, standing rigid, like a scarecrow. She couldn't make out any features, just a dark, humanoid shape. As she stared, a horrifying realization washed over her. The whispering she'd heard from under her own dock. Had it been a distraction? She felt pinned by its unseen gaze. It hadn't moved a muscle. It was just watching her. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this thing was what had been making the noises in the reeds. It had been moving along the shoreline, getting closer each night, learning her routine. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The sound was trapped in her throat. She just turned and ran. She didn't look back. She burst into the cabin, slammed the door, and fumbled with the lock. Her parents woke up to her hyperventilating in the main room. She tried to explain what she saw, but it sounded insane. A whispering under the dock. A skinny man on a deserted shore. They tried to calm her down, saying it was a trick of the moonlight, a deer, her imagination running wild before the end of vacation. It's a specific kind of fear, a true summer horror that sticks with you, especially when no one believes you. The next morning, they packed up the car to leave. As her dad was doing a final walkthrough, he called out from the back of the cabin, "Hey, did you kids go wading in the mud?" Clara and her brother said no. Her dad pointed to a series of wet, muddy footprints on the back porch. They were long, narrow, and clearly barefoot. They led from the edge of the woods onto their porch and stopped right at the back door. Clara says she'll never forget the feeling of that figure's gaze. She never went back to a lake cabin again. She says that sometimes, on quiet summer nights, if she listens hard enough, she can still hear that wet, gurgling whisper. The violation of a safe space is a terrifying thing. A place of peace, like a lakeside dock, turned into a stage for something deeply unsettling. You expect the woods to have animals, to have its own life. You don't expect it to be intelligent, malicious, patient. That story chills me because of the patience involved. The nightly routine, the slow approach. It's calculated. Our next story moves away from the isolated woods and onto something we all feel is a safe, contained space, our car. It's a story about a long, dark road and a piece of machinery that had no reason to be there. This account comes from a man named Leo, and it took place about 5 years ago. Leo was in his early 20s, working a summer job to save up for college. He lived in a fairly rural part of Ohio, where small towns are connected by long, 2-lane county roads that cut through endless fields of corn and soybeans. One Friday night in late July, he was driving home from his girlfriend's house. It was late, probably around 1:30 in the morning. The drive was about 40 minutes, and he knew the route by heart. It was a typical, humid summer night. His windows were down, the radio was playing low, and the only light for miles was from his own headlights, carving a tunnel through the darkness. He was about halfway home on a long, straight stretch of road bordered on both sides by towering cornfields. The corn was high that time of year, well over 6 feet, creating dense, dark walls on either side of the asphalt. It could feel a bit claustrophobic at night. Up ahead in the distance, he saw a single, dim yellow light. As he got closer, he saw that it was attached to some sort of large vehicle moving slowly in his lane. He slowed down, annoyed. It was a farm vehicle, a huge, old-looking combine harvester. This was the first strange thing. It was 1:30 in the morning. No farmer harvests their crops in the dead of night. Not only that, but this combine wasn't just on the road, it was working. The big, spidery header at the front was spinning slowly, its metal teeth glinting in his headlights. But it wasn't cutting corn in the field. It was just running as it chugged down the middle of the empty road. Leo slowed to a crawl behind it, looking for a chance to pass. The thing was massive, taking up almost the entire lane. He peered into the driver's cab, which was high above him, but the glass was grimy and dark. He could only make out a vague, still silhouette inside. After a minute of trailing it at 5 miles an hour, he saw his chance. A dotted yellow line appeared, signaling a passing zone. He checked for oncoming traffic. There was none, of course, and pulled into the left lane to overtake the monstrous machine. As he drew level with it, he glanced over at the cab again, trying to get a look at the driver. The silhouette was still there, completely motionless, head facing forward. It didn't even seem to register that he was passing. The sheer size of the machine next to his little sedan was unnerving. The engine noise was a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through his car. He pushed his foot down on the accelerator to get past it quickly. And this is where the pure, undiluted terror began. As Leo's car started to pull ahead, the combine harvester sped up to match his speed. He was shocked. These machines are built for power, not for speed. They top out at maybe 15, 20 miles an hour on a good day. Leo was doing 55, and the harvester was right there with him, its roaring engine now a deafening scream. The spinning header was a blur of metal just feet from his passenger door. Panic surged through him. He floored at 60, 65, 70 miles per hour. The combine stayed right next to him, its old, rusty frame shaking violently, its single yellow light glaring at him. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics he knew. He was now trapped, driving at a dangerously high speed in the oncoming lane, with a wall of corn on his left and this mechanical nightmare on his right. He risked another glance at the driver's cab. The silhouette was still there, and he could have sworn, just for a second, that its head turned slowly to look directly at him. He saw the end of the passing zone approaching fast. He had a choice: either slam on the brakes and pray the combine didn't crush him, or try to outrun it. He chose to run. He pushed his car to its limit, the engine whining. 80, 85. He was finally, inch by agonizing inch, pulling ahead. With just yards to spare before the passing zone ended, he jerked the wheel to the right, cutting back into his lane directly in front of the harvester. He didn't dare slow down. He kept his foot pinned to the floor, watching his rearview mirror. The combine's single yellow light filled his mirror, impossibly close. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the chase was over. The light began to shrink, falling away behind him at a rapid rate. He watched as it slowed, and then pulled over to the side of the road, coming to a complete stop. Its engine noise faded. Its single light blinked out, plunging the road behind him into total darkness. Leo didn't slow down until he saw the first streetlights of his town. He pulled into his driveway, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the key in the ignition. He just sat in his car for 10 minutes, trying to process what had happened. It was one of those roadside, unexplained encounters that defy all logic. There was no explanation. An old combine can't do 85 miles per hour. It just can't. He never drove that road at night again. He'd take the long way around on the main highway. He says that for the rest of that summer, he couldn't even look at the cornfields without feeling a cold dread, wondering what or who was sitting in that cab, waiting for the next lonely car on a dark summer night. Some fears are ancient. The fear of being chased by a predator is hardwired into our DNA. It doesn't matter if that predator is an animal or a rusty piece of farm equipment doing something it shouldn't be able to do. The feeling is the same. You are the prey. What makes Leo's story so deeply frightening is the sheer wrongness of it all. It's a tear in the fabric of reality. This final story is also about a tear in reality, but it's a different kind. It's not about being chased or watched by a single entity. It's about the very air around you turning against you, using your own words, your own fears, to terrorize you. This happened to a group of friends on what should have been a perfect camping trip. Our final story was shared by a guy named Mark on behalf of himself and 3 of his closest friends. In the summer after they graduated high school, the 4 of them decided to go on a multi-day backpacking trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were experienced hikers, they had all the right gear, and they were excited for one last adventure before they all went their separate ways for college. They hiked for a full day, getting deep into the backcountry, far from any designated campsites or other people. They found a perfect spot to set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by a dense forest of towering pine trees. As the sun set, they got a campfire going, cooked their dinner, and settled in for the night. Being teenage boys, they naturally started trying to spook each other. What started as a night of telling scary camping stories became one they were living. They told the usual tales, ghosts, Bigfoot, local legends. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows that made the surrounding forest seem alive. It was Mark's friend, Ben, who noticed it first. He was in the middle of a story about a hiker who went missing in these very woods. He reached the climax of the story, saying, "And they say on a quiet night, you can still hear him screaming for help." He delivered the line with dramatic flair, and then they all fell silent for effect. And in that silence, from deep within the woods to their right, they heard it, a faint, distant, but unmistakable sound. Screaming for help. It was a perfect echo of Ben's words, right down to the inflection. But it wasn't a normal echo. A normal echo would have bounced off a rock face, and it would have been immediate. This came a few seconds later, and it seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. And the voice. It sounded thin, reedy, and mocking. They all looked at each other, their bravado vanishing instantly. "Okay, who was that?" Another friend, Josh, asked nervously, looking around. Very funny. But they were the only 4 people for miles. They knew that. They tried to rationalize it, a weird acoustic phenomenon. The wind. But it had been too clear, too perfect. The mood was broken. They sat in an uneasy silence for a while, the campfire seeming much smaller and less comforting than before. To try and break the tension, the 4th friend, Sam, made a joke. "Well, at least it doesn't know about my crippling fear of spiders." He said it in a low voice, almost a mumble. A few seconds passed. Then, from the woods behind them this time, came the same thin, whispering voice. Fear of spiders. This time, there was no doubt. It wasn't an echo. It was a mimic. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, settled over the group. This thing wasn't just repeating their words. It was listening. It had repeated Sam's mumble with perfect clarity. Panic set in. Josh, the most pragmatic of the group, stood up. "This isn't right. We need to. I don't know. We need to be quiet." They all agreed. They stopped talking immediately. They just sat, staring into the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, which now seemed menacing. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh jolt of fear through them. After about 20 minutes of absolute silence, they started to relax a tiny bit. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had gotten bored. And then the true nightmare began. The voice came again. But this time, it wasn't echoing their campfire stories. It whispered, "Forgot to pack the extra water filter." The 4 boys froze. That was from a conversation Mark and Ben had had quietly by the car before they even started the hike. Miles away, hours ago, a moment later from a different direction. "Hope my mom doesn't find out I failed that math test." That was a secret Josh had confessed to Sam while they were setting up his tent. It was impossible. It was replaying their private conversations. It was plucking their own words, their own anxieties, out of the air and throwing them back. The voice was distorted, like a corrupted audio file, but the words were crystal clear. It was toying with them, demonstrating that it hadn't just been listening for the last hour. It had been with them the whole time. They didn't sleep a wink that night. They sat back to back, huddled around the dying embers of their fire, until the first gray light of dawn broke through the trees. The moment it was bright enough to see, they packed up their camp in a frantic rush and practically ran the entire way back to their car. The entire hike back, the woods were completely, unnaturally silent. Mark says the scariest part wasn't what it said, but the implication that something out there in the wild, ancient dark could not only hear and understand them, but could also access their memories, their recent past. It was a violation of the most fundamental kind. They never spoke about what happened in detail again, but none of them ever went deep woods camping again. Summer nights are a canvas, and on that canvas, we usually paint memories of joy and warmth. But sometimes, when we're not looking, something else picks up the brush. Something from the deep woods, or a lonely stretch of road, or the dark water of a quiet lake. The stories you heard tonight are unsettling because they feel real. They are grounded in familiar, comfortable summer settings that are twisted into something terrifying. A voice under a dock, a machine that defies physics, an echo that knows your secrets. They remind us that we are never truly alone, and that even on the warmest, most beautiful night of the year, there are shadows deep enough to hide anything. So, the next time you're out on a summer night, enjoying the warm air, and you hear a strange noise, just hope it's only the wind. Thank you for joining me in the darkness tonight. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, do me a favor and hit the like button. It lets me know you appreciate these kinds of tales. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the shadows. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you on a summer night? Let me know in the comments below. I read all of them. Stay safe out there, and good night.